All right, so we are live. Um, why don't we start? Firstly, thank you so much. Welcome Mahi, welcome Nick to this excellent,
Thank you.
thought-provoking episode on RCSA, right? Risk and control self-assessment. And there's a good chance we'll walk out of this session actually redefining it. Who knows? So before we get into all of that and much of the topic, why don't we start with super quick introductions? Both of you are extremely well accomplished, and seasoned information security and risk professionals in the banking world on Wall Street. So tell us your story a little bit. Maybe we'll start off with Mahi. Maybe I see you first, in this order. So Mahi, get going. Tell us a little bit of your story, and then we'll hand it over to Nick, and then we'll get on with our subject for the morning or for the afternoon for
Sure,
those who are tuning in from the East Coast.
sure, Shashank. Thanks for doing this. Excited to be on this webinar. Mahi Dantam Seti. I formerly was with State Street, where I was the global head of non-financial risk. I'm credited with setting up the whole non-financial risk discipline about eight years ago. And for me, what non-financial risk means, it includes cyber, technology risk, operational risk, resiliency, and third party risk. So these are the areas that I was responsible for at State Street. And I see a lot of interdependencies between them. And that's why we call it non financial risk, because financial risk can be boiled down to a number. But here, they are all different elements that need to be considered. Before that, I was at DDCC and Lockheed Martin and have worked both in startups and large companies.
Excellent. Well, fantastic to have you here. I think you've already kind of set the stage a tiny bit by talking about quantification versus qualitative pieces, but we'll get to it in a short bit. Well, over to you, Nick. Tell us your story. What's your story? How has your experience in the world of InfoSec and risk been?
First, I would like to appreciate Mai's background is awesome, and his smile is also awesome. So, yeah,
That's
so
important as well.
it's, it's,
Yeah.
Sometimes more important.
it's more
Yep.
important. So, my background is more, I would say, coming from a technology background, right? So, more network side of the house, network security, compliance, certifying companies. For either ISO 27001. Prior years, I've been in the Asia Pac side as well. So, done a lot of work for companies in the United States, globally, London, etc., managing security operations. But eventually, I grew up to be like a first line CISO, right? So, I've done high frequency trading work. I've been at Tower Research Capital as their global CISO, helped them with a lot of issues with regulations. Then I jumped on MUFG Securities, which is the institutional commercial banking arm. A lot of built up work, close work with second line, third line of defense. The name MUFG is everyone knows in the United States that we went through a bit of a rough ride, and that was a great experience working with second line when it comes to RCSAs. And then I also did head business continuity and DR at MUFG. Most recently, I was with Cantor Fitzgerald as their group CISO, responsible for two public companies, Newmark on the real estate side, commercial real estate, and then BGC Partners, which is an interbroker dealer. So two public companies, and then Cantor Fitzgerald, as we know, is now a well-known brand. As you know, the CEO for Cantor Fitzgerald is now the U.S. Commerce Secretary. So there was a lot of personal security work, plus public, plus private, and all over the place, I would say, right? And also, as Mai said, I did work with a lot of folks from the investment banking side to support them on the portfolio management of different cybersecurity companies as well. So that's my quick background.
Fantastic. Well, again, like I mentioned, super backgrounds from two outstanding people. So super thrilled to have both of you here. And super thrilled to kind of bring this discussion on RCSA up front, right? Because the topic of RCSA, I think, is sort of less understood, I would say, outside of the banking and the financial services industry, or rather, it's kind of understood in a confused way, if I were to use that word. And so I think it's exciting that we are talking about it, and hopefully our listeners will walk out of this with an enriched understanding of what it really means. So, so yeah, super thrilled about it. Why don't we start with this? I think the topic is big, and the topic really covers a lot of different aspects because in fact even the word risk and controls as such don't have a universal definition to an extent, right? Depending on the industry, depending on the maturity of your program, you think of those same terms in different lights. So maybe I think let's start there. I have always wondered also as a as a founder in this space and somebody who works with a lot of customers, like does everybody look at and understand risks as a starting point in the same way? So maybe let's start there. The non-financial risks, right? The risks that really we in this room are most interested in, right? Which is again in the context of the banking or financial services and insurance or the whole sort of larger space. What are those, right? What are the kind of these sort of non-financial risks? What part do they play, and what's this whole deal about even quantifying or not quantifying and understanding them? So maybe we'll start there. What might be good, I think, and what the listeners are going to enjoy in this session is let's pick up as much as we can share. I know there's a lot of sometimes restriction on what we can really share from our work lives, but let's see whatever we can share at least in abstract terms. And it would be fantastic if both of you could pick that thread up and share a little bit about your view on non-financial risk, right? Like how you see non-financial risk, and how do you kind of, um, how have you used different sorts of ways to understand it, to quantify it, to measure it, to do things with it. So yeah, so go for it in any order. Whoever wants to go first, go for it, and maybe even feel free to put a definition out there if you would like.
Yeah, Mike, go
Click,
ahead.
you want to go first? Go
No, you
ahead.
go ahead. Go ahead.
All right. So I think from my perspective, there are key elements of what non-financial risk is. In fact, funny story, when I was defining this, I was talking to the chief risk officer, my boss, Andy Kurutsky is there, who then is now vice chair at Oliver Wyman. And I said, I want to be known for something, not something, right? Non-financial. I want to be known, but it's so complex that that name stuck. Regulators started using it. So the name non-financial risk got used a lot, and that's how we're stuck with. But to me, like I said, it's uh, elements that you cannot easily boil down the risk to a financial number.
Mm-hmm.
And in the financial risk space, there's a direct correlation between risk and reward, right?
Right.
So if you are a bank, an example, you're giving out credit cards or mortgages, you can decide to maybe lower the FICO score for your customers and get more revenue, but you're also taking on more risk. You put more underwriting losses and you can manage it. In the non-financial risk space, there is no reward for taking on more risk. There is no reward for having poor hygiene, cyber hygiene, for example, right?
Right.
There's only
Right.
downside. So that's the element, that's the key differentiator, is there is no reward for taking on more risk, which happens on the financial risk side. On the non-financial risk side, all risk has to be reduced, right? So that's one key element. Second element is that there are a lot of interdependencies. If there's a cyber attack against your key third party, it's a cyber risk, it's a third party risk, it could be a resiliency risk, it could also be an operational risk, right? So it's
Mm-hmm.
all interplay together. Those are the key elements. And the third element is that there is a step function. As we were talking before, if you look at cyber, typically you look at losses on operational risk side, and based on losses, you put aside some reserves. But if you look at cyber, nobody is investing cyber dollars and budget based on past loss history, right?
Right.
Because one cyber incident could be a step function. It could be an existential threat to the company itself. So the how you budget, how you allocate, how you think about risk is much different in the non-financial risk space than the financial risk, right?
Right, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I want to kind of react to a couple of things that you put forth here, Mahi, because I think they are very thought-provoking, at least in my lens, and then I'll let Nick chime in as well here, is like this whole concept of course, something being defined as it not being a property as opposed to being a property, right? And I think like
Right.
that at some level I do feel like is also how the world kind of looks at a lot of things, right? For example,
Hmm.
financial risk is well understood because loss of money is easily understood. Let's put it that way, right? So in any situation wherever something is quantified into loss of a monetary value, I think people relate to it easily. Like, hey, there was a flood, and so many billions of dollars was lost, or there was a fire, and there was a loss of blah, right? So I think like that number really sticks, but there are obviously losses in multiple other ways that we experience in our lives. But I think whenever it's like non-monetary, but maybe even having higher ramifications, I think we as human beings get confused, right? So there is an
Yeah.
aspect of monetary versus non-monetary, right? And then the question, of course, that begs and comes in front of all of us is like, should we then translate everything to monetary loss, right? Like, is there a, sort of a reason for that? Because if that's how humans can relate to it. And then the second part that also I think is, sort of interesting is the fact that when you look at a lot of this loss modeling, right? And in my view, from my understanding, a lot of loss modeling again comes from monetary losses, primarily from an insurance type of a mindset, and other kinds of
Hmm.
loss modeling mindset was like, hey, we made so many losses over these kinds of situations over so many years, and therefore the average loss is so and so, right? um, or what's the variation in loss, etc. But I think like that kind of gets questioned, doesn't it, in the world in infosec, because modeling that is not only hard but maybe even irrelevant in some cases. So that's a good point. So maybe on that note, I'm going to transfer over to Nick. What do you think? Like, do you kind of agree, disagree with it? What have you experienced in terms of
So,
just understanding risk and loss at large?
so risk, especially when it comes to information security, right? So, I mean, people started using when they started looking at a lot of hacks happening to
Mm-hmm.
companies, they started using the jazzy word cyber, right? But at the end of the day, what you're trying to protect is your data, right? And as we have gone ahead from Y2K days to the days today, we are now on AI platforms, and you buy a laptop from a store, it has an AI chip in it, right? So data is becoming more and more like golden nuggets, right? So I think we are at a stage where, at an era where we are gonna redefine how we look at information risks, right? And information risk sits everywhere. It's whether it's financial, non-financial, reputational, to brand image, which is again reputational.
Mm-hmm.
But quantifying that is a challenge. There's a concept that we all know is in the banking world is like model risk, right? Which you touched upon a bit, right? So I think um, the best case scenario that at least I've seen is modeling or having assumptions or benchmarking your thoughts and scenarios based on what you've seen in the past that has occurred in the industry, right? So my like few years ago, I think 8 years ago, prior to COVID, DDoS was a big thing, right?
Hmm.
Now, if you look at that, all of a sudden, when I walked in at Cantor Fitzgerald, ransomware was the biggest topic,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Right, right, right.
And as I walked out, I see that due to Lockbit gang being butchered by FBI, now it's like uh, low news, good news, bad news, but everybody's now focused on supply chain and third party risk, right? So the definition of risk is changing, but at the same time, Shashank, I think we need something at speed that can automate the entire mundane process of how we can quantify risk and fundamentally look at risk, right? So RCSA is a topic today, and I
Mm-hmm.
think um, I would like us to just talk about that pain point. And I think Mahi, you worked on the other side of the house as well, right? The second line, the third line. And I've been predominantly in between some places, second line, first line, but predominantly first line. So I think you guys, you should be able to touch upon the pain, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I think there are two things that both of you brought up that I want to touch on. One is Shashank, you brought up the very valid point that there has to be some history to come
Mm-hmm.
up with losses, right? And
Right.
when you talk about new technology like AI and cyber, you don't have a history to come up with loss estimations. So that's a big, drawback in the non-financial space. And secondly, there's this implicit assumption that once you have a control, the control is effective and it works for all kinds of threats. So the threat view is missing. So I want to pick up on the point that Nick brought up, where we're talking about DDoS, right?
Right.
So back a decade ago, gigabit per second attacks were common, and if you had a control for DDoS that protects against gigabits, that was great. But now we are getting terabytes of attacks, right? So the control, any control will fail if you put enough stress on it, right? So that view has to be factored in also is I have a control, but what's the threat? Against what kind of threat is it sufficient? And what kind of threats will the control not be sufficient? And that is usually, again, not factored into the risk assess that we look at, right? It's a very dynamic environment. It has to be automated. Today's RCSAs are bespoke. The principles are good. The idea is, I think RCSA has done a great job in elevating the risk culture within a firm. They have brought the concept of risk and control to the forefront, getting the business involved. But what is lacking is technology to tie it all together.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Right. No, that's actually true, and I think that's a very good, couple of different points that both of you are making. Um, because the way I think about this is you have a bunch of interesting, um, I would say opportunities, right, or value props here. Because one point that you just made right now, Mahi, around the fact that at least now it's become front and center, right? For better or for worse, it may not be picture perfect, but the business feels it's important, right? At least there is a process that people are willing to look at because it is important, right? And then I think the point that prior to this, Nick, you were touching upon, and you were going quite, you had put an interesting perspective to it, is sort of giving reasons of why we can't do historical modeling because the playing field or the rules of the game have been changing just all the time, right? So, like you mentioned the story, like you walked into a particular role a few years ago, and DDoS was the big deal. That was the biggest threat, if you may, right? Or that was the biggest risk that was to be modeled, and you had to be ready for it, and you had to make sure what kind of losses you could suffer in case you really were hit by a big DDoS, right? And that was important. That was of paramount importance. But then we saw later on in the like whatever, fast forward a few years, I think solutions for the most part, containment of DDoS were there. I'm not saying perfectly there, but for the most part were there. So it didn't seem like a catastrophic risk anymore, right?
Uh-huh.
And then you spoke about ransomware and others. And again, irrespective of whatever those threats are, I think the point that I took away from that was like it's a moving target. It's not a fixed historical apples to apples comparison, right? It is like the loss of A today, but there's a loss of B tomorrow. And so, like, how do you even bring them all together? Um, where do you think is the hope here then? Given that we are in this, sort of current state where, things are only getting worse from a information security risk standpoint. Where do we think we have hope in terms of both understanding of risks and also containment of these risks, or rather management of these risks? Like, what's the thought there? What do both of you think about it?
So,
Nick?
yeah, so thank you, Mike. Um, I think if I may say that is there are three categories which I always focus on, like people, process, tech, right? So
Mm-hmm.
um, we know with the advent of AI, the people part is going to be more efficient if you have the right skilled people who understand what they're doing, right? When it comes to process, since we're talking about RCSA, I can bet even today that it's a slow process, right? It's like my asking questions to Nick Salian, hey Nick, okay, previous years we had DDoS attacks, at this period, before the board meetings. What's the probability you think of this happening? And Nick Salian would say, oh, I have a Cloudflare solution out there, is sitting there. That's good. But then after 1 year, Mahi again comes back and says, Nick, you said you had Cloudflare, but still we got attacked. Oh, that was a different kind of attack. That was more like a web app application DDoS attack. We do
Hmm.
not have protection against that. So the point that I'm trying to drive is that we need to, due to the advent of AI, the attacks to our infrastructure and the cloud environments is going to change. Is
Right.
going to be through AI, right?
Right. Right.
So we have to be more agile and pick up speed. So here is what, and that's why I said we may, as you said, we may redefine things here. Is that with solutions within the space of GRC, right?
Right.
That can bring in automation, and the first step should be to cut down all the mundane, repetitive tasks. So the teams coming to the first line and asking questions, the same control questions back and forth, that creates a lot of, I would say, energy drain, right, for everybody. So
Right.
we need to get automation there. And once we cut down on those mundane tasks, and now we are ready as one team to start looking at the real risk, real time. And then when you take it to the CISO or the chief risk officer or the CEO, they are actually looking at that risk at that point in time, right? They're not looking at something what's historic, what's gonna, we don't know what's gonna happen tomorrow. But what
Right.
we need is real time. And for that, we need AI.
Yeah, absolutely. No, no, I couldn't agree more. Obviously, of course, also building in this space and seeing this closely, the hard reality, and of course, RCSA is a good candidate for it, but just about most of the processes that we are in today, the hard reality is that it's pretty tricky to do things at scale, right? And the reason why it's pretty tricky to do things at scale is because it just takes a lot of time. And we deal with a lot of unstructured data and lots of unknowns and lots of human judgment. So by the time we are able to cover all the ground, we probably spilled over to the next cycle, right? It's
Yeah.
taken us
Hmm.
months to get there, right? So we are almost always doing that catch up game, unfortunately. And so I think, like, unless we find a way to automate that out, right, whatever that mechanism is, AI certainly seems to be very promising in that puzzle, but some way to automate it out and then essentially do all those mundane tasks for us, right? Us as professionals at large in this space. That's our only chance, if you may, right? Like, that's the only chance that we can actually cover the population and not keep doing the,
Yeah.
the rough sort of sampling based, sort of work out there, right? So I feel like, yes, there is definitely 100% validity in using technologies like AI, and more than that, also just accelerating this story of doing assessments at large, if you may, with automation, with heavy influence from technologies like AI, which can end up doing very human-centric work, right? And so I think, like, that's definitely something that's worth considering and worth investing time, energy, money in for sure.
Yep. Well, I would disagree with you a little bit, Shashank.
Go for it. Go for
I
it.
think my North Star is a fully automated real-time process where we don't need to do a Excel, right? That's the
Mm,
North Star, right? A
I
world where
agree.
we don't need to do every quarter, get everybody together in a workshop and come up with risk, right? It should be fully automated, real-time process.
Right.
Assuming that's our North Star, how do we get there? And you're right, there are like steps we need to take. So that's the promise. The thing that got excited, I'm excited about with AI is if you look at it, there's a wealth of information that companies have about their risk and controls that
Right.
just doesn't come together, right? There's
Right. Right.
information in your GRC tool. There's information from your pen test reports. There's information from your red team exercises. There's control owners who test their controls and failure of the controls. Their
Right.
risk, their business process. All of these are in different disparate systems. They're in different unstructured data. Some are in a tool, some are in a database, some are in a PDF file if you're getting a pen test report from somebody. So AI can actually take all of that stuff and put it together in a cohesive manner so that now we can understand why some controls are effective or not effective because of all the information and the wealth of information we have. We can talk about risk. I think that's the promise. That's what gets me excited about this the advent of AI is now we can actually leverage the wealth of information companies have, bring it together in a common format. Of course, there are some building blocks. You need to have a common lexicon of what risks are, what controls are, so that you can associate and tie them together, right? I think that's what's exciting.
Right, right, right. No, no, absolutely. I think you made a super good point there. You know what you're really saying is that um, the current activity automation is one thing, and that's great, right? But how about even rethinking it? Like, what's the point of doing this periodic task to begin with, right? And why even automate that periodic task? Because the efficacy or the relevance of that periodic task itself is kind of questionable, if you may, right? So why not do a continuous process? Why not let the system be read by this machine, if you may, or this intelligence system, and then tell us and identify things for us so that we can not only do things at scale, but actually do things that matter, right? Do things which are of highest importance rather than trying to scramble through, all kinds of just periodic sort of get together in a room and quickly make some judgment call and call it done, right? Like this is
Right.
more scientific. So
Yeah.
no,
I
absolutely,
mean,
that's a
there are
very valid point.
parallels. Yeah, there are parallels in the financial risk space. Like, you have value at risk. They boil
Right,
down everything down to a single number, and it's real time. People act on it. If
right.
your value at risk goes up, but you don't have a corollary in the non-financial risk space, then I think the ultimate goal would be to get there because it's real time. It's a risk that can be quickly understood and acted upon. Right. Typically, if you look at the risk curve, it's like a bell curve, right? The high frequency, low losses are at the peak of the curve, but most of the non financial risks are tail risks, right?
Mm,
They're the
mm,
ones happening on the tail end of the bell curve. And for that, you can't have loss history, you can't impact, come up with good estimates. I mean, if you ask the CISO, what's the impact of a poorly configured firewall? I mean, it's going to be, coming up with dollar numbers. It's kind of, I can Nick is smiling. It's their guesstimate, right? How do you guess how much the financial losses of a poorly configured firewall? It doesn't work that way on the non-financial risk, right? Yeah.
And then
Right.
also, if you have technical debt of having so many firewall rules
Right.
which are dated on that, that's another risk.
Yeah.
Who knows what's been
Yeah.
out there sitting there forever, right? So,
Exactly. So continuous controls monitoring is part of this, which feeds the GRC tools, so we can make sense of that. It is very important, right?
right.
No, no, absolutely. So I think that what we're really getting towards is like there are two or three themes I'm sort of seeing here, right? In what both of you are saying. One is, of course, like, hey, we've got to get more continuous. This whole periodic activity of getting in a room and trying to make judgment calls is great. It's nice. It's something, but it's not actionable. It's not complete, right? Like there's still too many holes in it. And then the second one that why not have a bottoms up continuous way of just assessing it all the time, right? Where we leverage technology, we leverage things like AI, which automates away, reads all this unstructured inputs, makes decisions, maybe boils it down to a single number, right? Like value at risk. Maybe there is a monetary correlation to it. Maybe some other forms of both qualitative and quantitative judgment, but kind of goes from there, right? And so that's something that becomes more useful, right? And then you can work with it. So I want to switch this a tiny bit. I think these are fantastic points, and I'm feeling anybody who's involved in an RCSA exercise is perhaps as they're listening, they're thinking about this and saying like, "Hey, this is cool new way of doing," and I think we should definitely lend ourselves to it. Um, Question though is if you start looking at the not just the process but the end goal of risk and risk quantification, I think that by itself is a topic where the world doesn't have consensus, right? We have seen that in the infosec world itself, every CISO I speak to has probably three opinions, not one, on what risk quantification should be, which method is appropriate, should one even quantify such things. There's been, of course, lots of these things like the FAIR Institute's work and CRQ and what have you in the past and alternatives. But I don't think anything has really taken off in a way where there is consensus in our industry, right? Like there isn't a way where people are saying, okay, here is the right way to quantify stuff, and this quantification is most relevant, right? What is your take on it? Like, and again, both of you go for it, in whatever order that you please, but share your three opinions if you may each. As I was sort of half joking because there isn't really consensus, but what's your take on this whole risk quantification, right? Like,
Yeah.
is it even something we should waste our energy on, or rather invest on energy on? Let me not, prejudge or pre-qualify as waste. So,
Yeah, so maybe I'll take it and then Nick, you can chime in, right? So I think, we got to go back to, brass tacks. What is the purpose of quantification, right? It
Mm-hmm.
is to inform and drive action. That's the whole purpose, right?
Right.
Once we get a number, we say, okay, it's beyond our threshold, it's beyond our risk appetite, and it's informing the board, informing management, and it drives certain action. So the question is, are there other ways we can drive that without trying to boil it down to a number? Because trying to focus too much on quantification, I think, is putting the cart before the horse. I have this comment I make, it's a fallacy of precision. When you start talking about decimal digits and people start assuming there's high level of accuracy in how you're bidding all this together. And there are certain things which cannot be quantified, in especially non-financial space, like I said. It's going to be, best guess in the best of days and to try to quantify it into one number, right? So
Mm-hmm.
that doesn't work.
Yeah.
I think the second element of quantification is the fact that because there are so many interdependencies, it becomes very hard. How do you actually quantify and bring up? Because it depends on the business unit. There's so many variables that actually drive how you try to quantify this number. So
Right.
I think
Right.
that's the challenge with quantification is there has to be a better way, and I have some thoughts on that, but maybe for a different webinar. But how do we actually get the board's attention, senior leadership's attention on certain things without trying to boil it down to a single number, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So you're
I
saying the
think the second,
single number is kind of questionable, is what I'm hearing from you. Like the single
yeah,
number is both hard to do and may not even represent the whole reality, right?
exactly. I mean, so represent the whole reality is, I talk about epistemic risk,
Mm-hmm.
which is, there are known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns, right? So
Right.
typically, when the CISO would come in, and every CISO has this data, they talk about, patching stats, and they would say, I'm 98% or 99% compliant, and that's beyond my risk appetite, so I'm green. And the question I ask is, what's the denominator of that? And the
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
denominator is all the assets that the CISO can has visibility into. So when I say, okay, does it include IoT devices? Does it include, display devices? Does it include third party? And often the answer is no, because that's not what I manage, right? So sometimes the risk is in what is not being measured rather than what is being measured, right?
Right.
So
Right.
understanding where we have a lack of visibility into our environment. We may not know the risk. Maybe there's low risk because well managed, or maybe there's high
Right.
risk, but we don't know
Right.
what it is. Sometimes focusing on that is a lot more important, and then trying to quantify what you can already measure, right? So the known unknowns are sometimes where the biggest challenge lies, right? You have seen lots of examples of firms getting breached because they didn't know they had a connection here, or they don't know they had the relationship with this vendor that really brought together a major issue for the company, right? So I think that's the other problem with quantification is you assume that you know everything about your environment, versus non-financial risk, it's hard.
Yeah. 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 That's actually a very good point. I think that what you're really saying is that the whole sort of unknown unknowns, and again, it kind of goes back to I think what Nick was saying earlier in a way, right, where there are certain kinds of threats, certain kinds of issues at a given point in time, and then the kind of the threat surface has moved on, if you may, right, or the world has moved on, and so the threats that are real now may be a completely new set, right, and you might be totally even unaware of it, and then if you take that down a level deeper, there is a second level of sort of loss of visibility or lack of visibility where there might be a threat which at the highest level feels like everything is contained, but like you said, like, hey, there is a certain connection that is implicitly open, or there's a certain kind of a behavior that doesn't manifest in the highest level of sort of scans or highest level of understanding, but it sort of can be exploited, can be violated, right, to then suddenly lead to catastrophic impact, because otherwise just seen in isolation it doesn't seem like a big problem. It's like, okay, yeah,
Yeah.
sure, we have a connection with with something, and that seems benign, right? And we have seen attacks like that, in fact, hasn't haven't we? I mean, there were attacks where the big, if I recall my facts right, even the big target attack, which was among the the time when the
Third
attacks were
party,
becoming
yeah,
bigger, right? Like before that,
right,
the attacks were seldom. They weren't very big in terms of monetary and reputation risk, and certainly like the target attack made news quite a bit, with senior execs sort of having to take accountability for it. But that came from like an HVAC vendor or somebody, isn't it? Like a
exactly,
right,
yeah.
there was some benign permissions or something that was given to an HVAC, and nobody probably, I'm sure, within that organization even accounted for it or inventory did because it didn't seem like that important or useful, right? Because like,
Hmm.
yeah, sure, there's an HVAC vendor. What kind of permissions could they have, right? Or it might be very little. So I think like it's interesting what both of you are saying is that in the world of infosec, it's kind of like almost war games, if you may, right? Like the
Yeah.
strategies are changing, threats are changing. Well, how do you take historical? What do you quantify? And if you quantify, also it needs to be like then continuously quantified in some ways and continuously re-understood, right?
Hmm.
So here's I would say like most of the CEOs of companies, ultimately they know that cyber is the most important risk of this era, and on top of that, AI is adding another complexity, right? So if you're a businessman, if you think from a CEO standpoint, right, you have you had to pay X amount of dollars to this new kid around the block who's now saying, "I'm not just an IT person, but I'm also a security person." Right? What is security for this CEO?
Mm-hmm.
I have
Mm-hmm.
physical security, the guard that's standing out. I have a secret service agent who's protecting XYZ, depends on the company's business model. And then I have this cyber guy who's new kid on the block. Like, I don't know how to handle this guy, right? Okay, let me put this person, guy or girl, under this technology function, the CIO function, right? Now, the CIO function or the CTO function, ultimately, they know how to run technology. But what about risk, right? Risk is a different definition. And some places, the CISO is tossed into the COO function because, okay, maybe it's part of operations, right? And risk probably reports into operations somewhere. So the language of I would say risk is changing as it moves from department to department in various companies, depending on the type of business. But the risks from a horizon scan standpoint for the company based on their business doesn't change. They have to clearly have a proper outlook. If you are the CEO, you need to have a proper outlook of in your industry, what does cyber risk mean to you? And what are the possible insurance coverage you can get in order to cover yourself for the non-financial side of the house, right? Because your CISO or CTRO or XYZ, whatever titles you give, they ultimately are saying that, okay, from a cyber maturity standpoint, this is my risk score. Right? And then based on the risk score, hey, CEO, this is where we need to invest. This is where we need to mature. And the CEO is going to say, okay, what is the underlining statement behind this, right? Let me open up the hood and see what's out there, right? And by the time they start looking at that, it's too late because they've almost spent like 2 3 years firing 2 3 CISOs already, right? Because they did not pan out, right? Uh,
Right.
so, um, so I think this is my based on experience, like quantifying risk. When you go in front of the board, I've done board meetings. Go in front of the board, you talk about risks in terms of quantification. Some places it makes sense, some places it doesn't make sense, right? And
Mm-hmm.
most of the places it doesn't make sense because they consider cyber as more less quantified risk, but more based on what we have seen in the past, what's the industry talking about, what's my other CEO friend just lately talking about a phishing attack or whatever. Oh, I lost like zillions of dollars or a phishing attack. That's the question the CISO is being asked. The
Right.
CISO is not being asked the question most often how much vulnerabilities you have on your vulnerability scanning tool. And what happens is the CISOs ultimately make a mistake. They go in front of the boards and they're talking about these are the bean count of my critical vulnerabilities, hives. And that's what when second line and third line go in front of the OCC FRB, they're talking about these are the high critical, these are the low, these are the medium, right? And they don't understand. So what's
Yeah.
very critical is, I think when we did begin this conversation with redefining things, I think we have to redefine risk itself, from an information security standpoint, right? There could be thousands of mitigating controls. There'll be thousands of cyber companies like Uno.ai, etc. They all will come. They bring up solutions, right? But we need a framework. We need one single model, like other units of a firm or a company. Like a CFO has a model he or she uses for financial risk modeling. Something like that we need for cyber, so that everybody follows their standard. Like NIST is something that we all use as CISOs. Uh, NIST 2.0, nice. They added the governance module on top. It helps, right?
Mhm.
But the point is, I've done 3 to 4 NIST-based risk assessments in my career, and when we get the risk register in front of ops risk, that's the only thing that they look at, and they look at, oh, this has been red, amber, yellow.
Yeah.
What's the current status, right? Nick, what's the risk appetite? Oh my God, we just accepted this risk last year and now we had a hack because we accepted it. Now, what are we going to do? So it's like a complete mess. So we need something in reality which is real time, that makes life easy for
Mhm.
everybody, right? So then we can start thinking what risk means to my business, to my organization, and that's how I'll approach my CISO function or the risk function, the CTRO function, right? So that's my thought.
I mean, Nick brings up a good point that we should look at risk holistically. So the non-financial risk. So the analogy I like to use is if I go to my doctor, I use a healthcare analogy and think of your blood test as your CRQ, right? Because cyber is everywhere. So I go with my blood test report to the doctor, and the doctor just doesn't look at the blood test report and say, this is what you need to do. He'll ask me for my history. He asks me my parents, what are my lifestyle changes, what kind of, how active I am. He's looking at it holistically and then recommending. So when we look at just CRQ, we're just looking at cyber. We are missing, maybe there are architectural issues that if we fixed will actually help cyber a lot more. So
Yeah.
we have to look at it holistically, the whole non-financial risk space, because of the interdependencies. I think that's one of the issues with CRQ. It's too cyber focused, and sometimes, as Nick can allude, it's not cyber that has to solve the problem. It's architecture, it's business, it's other elements that actually will help drive more positive action in cyber than just trying to focus on the CISO and their task.
I told you to buy that data loss prevention plugin on the browser, but you did not agree. You just got the network side of the house covered, right?
Yeah,
When when
right.
when you go to second line and say, "Oh, I've got data loss prevention," but where?
Yeah,
Just
exactly.
on that,
Right.
just on an endpoint or on a network, right? So just having a like a fly on the wall saying, "I have these solutions." Solutions don't solve problems. Having right processes and having the right people solve problems, right? And the
Right.
right tech as well.
Actually, that's another like a good point that you guys are making here, which is that uh, I think the approach to the solution, if you may, itself, and I'm just up leveling it a little bit. Lots of good conversations that you folks have already made, both of your points, is that even understanding where to put dollars, where to put focus, what to do, in some ways is a function of the capability of the people and process behind it, not just the tools, right? Like, sure, the tools are enablers, and yes, you need better and smarter tools, and yes, a lot of these AI driven tools might even up level the game, but ultimately it'll still go back down to people and process and how we are making decisions and what battles we are picking, because it's not going to be that same repeatable strategy or same repeatable battle that you can keep unfolding over and over again, right? Like, there's a lot about just understanding it. Like, hey, which one do we fight? Why do we fight it? What's the chance of winning this one? Or, in more cyber terms, mitigating this or avoiding it, right? Or if it does happen, how can we recover from it quickly? So,
Yeah, I
yeah,
think
no,
tooling is important because let me give you an example there where I second line.
yeah,
Audit comes around, issues an issue, some control weakness to the CISO, and the CISO is having a conflict with audit, saying, "Well, we agree, but it's very hard to exploit this weakness, right? Because we have defense in depth, we have these layers of defense. that will prevent it from being exploited. And I, as a risk person, second line, come in and I'm, fighting CISO's cause against audit and saying, hey, here's what it is. And it's very manual. But if you were able to bring it all together, then it's very powerful for the CISO to go in and say, well, I agree this control weakness is there, but it's not exploitable because we have all this defense in depth. We have had a red team exercise against this control that showed that it was effective. We had an external pen test. We have control owners coming in and saying they're done. So when you bring this wealth of information, then it becomes very easy to justify why certain actions need not be taken, and help prioritize, to your point, Shashank, where the real focus should be on, right? A lot of times we spend a lot of energy in fixing low risk items because we're not able to justify why it's low risk, right? There's a control failure, and then people assume that because the control failure, it's important to be fixed. But if we can show the reachability analysis, saying, well, yes, we agree, we're not disagree, this control failure is there, but it's hardly exploitable because of all the other things we have around it, then make it very powerful. It's a good story to tell the board and management that we are really focused on the most important things,
Right.
and tooling is important. And that's where the tooling should bring all this together, so it's easy to prove why certain things should be deprioritized, right?
No, absolutely, absolutely. 100%. I think that completely makes sense. So I know there are a lot of good sort of points being made here. We'll soon be coming up on our hour, if you may. So I think I want to change the gear a little bit before we wrap up. And the point that I want to always emphasize a part of these conversations is that we have seen that these, sort of the content that we produce, and the main idea of this is really more education than anything else. Sharing perspective, sharing ideas, so that people at various stages in their career both can come participate, chime in, but also can learn from our experiences, right? So I think like what I would love to see is, as we begin to wrap this session up, what's your key takeaway, right? We started with RCSA, and like we had some great discussions around risk and controls themselves and the whole process of self-assessments, even questioning it to an extent, then went on to also looking at just cyber risk management at large. So I would love for both of you to take maybe turns and just talk through, like, if there's a new CISO who's taking on this responsibility, or somebody who is kind of growing into that role, what would be your advice? Where should they start looking? Where should they start focusing in terms of these, not only RCSA, but broader risk management puzzle, if you may, right? As an InfoSec leader, right? And eventually perhaps as a CISO. So, like, where should they focus? What should be their priorities? How can they be on top of these things? So, would love to get both of you to chime in on that.
Why don't you go?
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. So I'll speak from experience, right? So everyone knows when a CISO joins a firm, they need to do their own assessment, right? They do all kinds of different risk assessments, etc., right? But what's the approach that usually works is if you can collaborate with the business and understand what is that keeps them up in the night, right? Especially the CEO, if you have the opportunity to talk, right? Or your manager, whoever it is, right? Doesn't matter. What is that they think is the most important risk? And then do a horizon map based on your business to see where do you stand compared to others. Doing that kind of assessment helps you to be very proactive and focused in terms of understanding what has been deployed before you walked into that organization, right? When you walk into the organization, there may be someone already, you know, have already spoken to companies like Uno.ai or another company, and they're already doing some incubation of AI, tool sets, etc. So
Mm-hmm.
it's as a CISO, what I've learned over the years, over 8 years in different roles is what has worked for me is you walk in, you really talk to your team first to understand what are the challenges that they're facing from other groups when it comes to maturing the program, right? And then you get a quick idea in a week or two about where is the weakness, people, process, or tech, right? And then pick up those areas. Collaboration is very important. So understanding risk most often I've seen is operational risk function is kind of ignored by most of the CISOs. And that's the important function which actually gives a tough cookie to the CISO, usually, right?
Right.
Internal audit as well. So GRC is a very critical function. So there are different kinds of CISOs. You have risk only risk background CISOs. You have technology background CISOs. You have blend of both. You have CISOs who are just branding CISOs. They are like the people who can go on advertisements on television, and talk about security, right? Um, and there are CISOs who have got scars on their back because they've done a lot of incident responses, etc. Right? So I would say just to finish my thoughts is that when you look at at an organization, when you walk in, don't just look at from a perspective of your own lens. Understand where you're walking in, understand the people, talk to compliance, legal, and the internal audit, and especially if there's a second line function, do collaborate with them, and then talk to your team. Then take a pen and paper and write down what do you think, define it, and after you define it, validate it with all the people that you spoke to, and then you bring external third parties, because bringing solutions, bringing third party consultants is easy.
Mm.
What the biggest pain is, I'll give you a quick example. What's the biggest pain for a CFO, if you ask ever, is deploying an ERP and Oracle tool, right? It could make or break the CFO's function. Similar to that, CISO function, it's a make and break. If you're not successful in maturing the program and understanding the regulatory and the auditors, right? It will break you if you really don't collab. That's my 2 cents on this.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Good words
Yeah.
of wisdom,
Yeah.
Mahi. Please
Well
tell.
said, Nick. So what I like to add to that is that as an incoming CISO, I think my advice would be to expand your horizon and think of yourself just not as the leader of the security function, but think of it as you're contributing to the non-financial risk, because that will actually help you get involved with third party. You see a lot of CISO dealing with third party issues, right? When third party gets hacked. So understanding who are the critical third parties to the firm, what is their security posture, because that will have a direct impact to you and your role. Understanding, from audit and second line, where do they see some of the risk and control weaknesses? Is there a common lexicon so that you and the second line and audit and the business can all talk about risk the same way? And discuss the controls the same way. That's going to be important. And I think I would say you should accelerate the use of GRC tools, because biggest challenge we have with Gen AI and AI tools is people talk about the use case, and
Mm.
people are worried about reputational harm, client harm, privacy, disclosure. But when you are using AI for GRC, it's internal. You don't have
Mm.
any of those risks, right?
Right, right.
And you can actually educate yourself, get your team more informed about how these tools work, and you get a huge bang for the buck, because it can actually build your case to reduce the unnecessary work you're doing if we can use the power of these tools to show why certain risks are real risk and why certain risks can be deprioritized by some of the
Truly.
examples I talked about, right? So I think this is a low-hanging fruit. It's huge benefit for the CISOs to focus on this. It helps them prioritize their budget. It helps them focus on the key risks and brings the whole non-financial risk together, right? Helpful for the firm.
Absolutely. Fantastic. I think both of you have shared some extremely valuable, tips and tricks, if you may, or perspectives for leaders who are getting into this role, or perhaps those who are already there. So very cool. Fantastic discussion. Didn't even realize the hour has almost passed by, right? Like some lots of good inputs right here, right? Right from starting with, the sort of challenges of RCSA to opportunities out there to ways that we should look at risk at large in this function. And then, of course, ending with some brilliant advice for current leaders, right? And so yeah, so thank you very much. Thank you for being part of this wonderful discussion and conversation. One thing that I always do in these webinars, thank you again for being a guest. Both of you are extremely accomplished. It's an absolute honor to kind of have both of you on this forum. Where would people find you? Because, I've always seen that these videos these days are consumed post facto. Most people will get hold of these at some point in time, will like some content, and then they want to connect with that person that they heard this from. And so, from that standpoint, if somebody listens to this, let's say next week, and says, "Well, I need to go get hold of Nick," or I would love to go talk to Mahi, where should they find you? What's the best place? Which social media? Where are you folks active? And what's the best way for anybody to reach out to either one of you?
I think LinkedIn for me is
Likewise,
the best.
like
Yeah, yeah,
yeah, likewise, we're all right now active on LinkedIn. Yeah.
yeah.
Excellent. All right. So as I post these recordings, I'll also post links to your profiles. And for anybody listening in, as you all heard, Mahi and Nick both are happy to connect there on LinkedIn and, take your questions or additional sort of inputs or pieces of, sort of discussion that you might be interested in. So absolutely go for it, connect with them directly. And yeah, thank you again. Thank you for joining the session. Any last little words before we sort of wrap up?
Well, thanks, Shashank. This was a blast. Thanks, Nick. Great discussion. Really enjoyed doing this.
Likewise, thank you, Shashank, and we wish you good luck on your journey with Uno.ai.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay. All
Thank you.
right, everyone. Bye for now.
Bye. Take
Bye.
care.